Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. Number the last voyage of the Hellene, may the sea never forgets. That's what my father told me when I was a boy, standing on the docks of Portland Harbor as he prepared to ship out on another 3-month journey. The sea keeps its own record, he said, of every ship that sailed her, every man who's drowned in her depths, and every promise made upon her waters. I didn't understand then, I do now. My name is Captain Malcolm Thorne, and after 43 years at sea, I'm making my final voyage. The shipping company wanted to throw me a retirement party at headquarters, complete with cheap champagne and insincere speeches from executives who have never set foot on a vessel. I declined. Instead, I requested one last command, one final journey on my beloved Helene May. The Helene May isn't much to look at these days. A cargo freighter built in the late 1980s, she served faithfully through hurricane seasons and economic downturns alike. She's weathered storms that would have torn lesser vessels apart, and she's carried everything from grain to machine parts across the world's oceans. The company has newer ships now, more efficient vessels with smaller crew requirements and better fuel economy. But the Helene May is mine, has been for the last 18 years, and I couldn't imagine ending my career on any other deck. The route is simple, Portland to Singapore, a final delivery of agricultural equipment. 28 days at sea if the weather cooperates, my last 28 days as master of a vessel. We departed yesterday at dawn, the harbor still shrouded in that peculiar October fog that clings to the water like a jealous lover. I stood on the bridge, feeling the familiar vibration of the engines beneath my feet as we navigated the channel. First Officer Jenkins handled the departure procedures with his usual efficiency, while I watched the shoreline of my home port disappear into the mist. "Course is set, Captain," Jenkins said, handing me the logbook. "We'll clear the coastal traffic by nightfall." I nodded, signing off on his notations. Weather report, clear sailing for the first week at least. There's a system developing near Japan, but it shouldn't affect us until we're much closer to our destination. Very good. I returned the logbook and moved to the windows, watching as the last traces of land vanished behind us. "I'll be in my quarters, call me if anything changes." "Aye, Captain. My cabin is located just behind the bridge, standard captain's quarters on a vessel this size. It's not luxurious by any means, but it's comfortable enough. A bed, a desk, a small private bathroom, and a window that looks out over the port side of the ship. I've never needed much more than that." I spent the afternoon reviewing our cargo manifest and crew roster. 14 souls aboard for this journey, a smaller complement than we would have carried 20 years ago, but technology has reduced our manpower needs. I know most of them well. Jenkins has been my first officer for nearly a decade. Chief Engineer Morales has been with the Helene May even longer than I have. The others are a mix of veterans and newer crew members, all competent, all reliable. Night fell quickly, as it does at sea in October. I took my dinner in my quarters, then returned to the bridge for the evening check-in. Everything was in order, course steady, engines performing normally, weather conditions favorable. I stayed for an hour watching the stars emerge from behind thin clouds, then retired to my cabin. Sleep has never come easily to me at sea. It's not insomnia exactly. More like a heightened state of awareness that never fully subsides, even after decades of experience. Every creak of the hull, every change in the engine's pitch, every shift in the vessel's motion registers in my consciousness, even in slumber. It's what makes a good captain, this constant vigilance, but it makes for light sleep, which is why, when I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of unfamiliar footsteps in the corridor outside my cabin, I was instantly alert. The footfalls were heavy, heavier than any of my current crew would make, and deliberate, moving slowly past my door toward the bridge. I listened, waiting for voices, for some indication of who might be walking the passageway at this hour. But there was only silence after the footsteps faded. I rose, pulled on my trousers and a sweater, and stepped into the corridor. Empty. The lights were dimmed for night operations, casting long shadows along the walls. I moved toward the bridge, expecting to find whoever had passed by my door, but when I arrived, only Third Officer Chen was present, monitoring our course. "Evening, Captain," he said, looking up from the navigation console. "Everything all right? Did someone just come through here?" I asked. Chen shook his head. "No, sir, it's been quiet, just me for the last hour." I frowned. "I heard footsteps in the corridor, headed this way. Maybe someone went up to the observation deck," Chen suggested. "I can check the security feed if you'd like." "No, that's all right." I moved to the windows, looking out at the moonlit ocean stretching to the horizon. "How's our course?" "Steady, sir. We're making good time." 15 knots with favorable currents. I nodded, still distracted by the footsteps. Perhaps I'd been dreaming after all. "Carry on then. I'm going to walk the deck for a bit." "Aye, Captain." The night air was cool and damp as I stepped outside onto the main deck. The Helene May sliced through the water with a rhythmic motion I knew as intimately as my own heartbeat. Moonlight silvered the ocean's surface, creating a shimmering pathway that seemed to stretch infinitely before us. I walked slowly along the starboard side, letting the familiar sounds of the ship wash over me, the hum of machinery, the rush of water against the hull, the occasional ping from the radar equipment. I was nearly at the bow when I saw him. A figure stood at the railing, gazing out at the sea. Even in profile, even in the dim light, I recognized him immediately. The broad shoulders, the distinctive stance with hands clasped behind his back, it was a posture I'd seen countless times over the years. It was William Hayes, my former chief engineer. The problem was that William Hayes had died 7 years ago when his heart gave out in the middle of the Pacific. I froze, convinced I was hallucinating. Hayes continued to stand motionless at the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were watching for something approaching. I took a step forward, and another, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would alert him to my presence. "Hayes," my voice was barely audible over the sound of the waves. He turned then, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was him, the same weathered features, the same salt and pepper beard, but his eyes were wrong. They reflected the moonlight too brightly, like polished glass rather than living tissue. "Captain Thorne," his voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking through water. "Beautiful night for sailing, isn't it?" I couldn't respond. My throat had closed up, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Hayes smiled, a familiar expression that sent a chill down my spine, and turned back to the ocean. "Don't look so frightened, Captain. I'm just checking on the old girl, making sure she's being properly maintained." He ran a hand along the railing. "She's a good ship, deserves to be treated right." I managed to find my voice. "You're not real," Hayes chuckled, the sound hollow and echoing. "Real enough to be having this conversation, aren't I?" He looked back at me. "I've missed her, missed the sea. It calls to you, doesn't it, even when you're ashore?" "Even when you're—" he trailed off, looking down at his hands. "Dead," I finished for him. "You're dead, Hayes. We buried you at sea. I read the service myself." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "I remember. You chose Psalm 107. Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep." A fitting choice. A cold sweat had broken out across my forehead. I was talking to a dead man, or hallucinating that I was. Neither possibility boded well for my mental state. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Hayes turned fully toward me then, and in the moonlight I could see that his clothing was soaked through, water dripping steadily onto the deck. It wasn't raining, the sea was calm. Yet he stood before me, drenched as if he'd just been pulled from the ocean. "Want?" He seemed to consider the question. "I don't want anything, Captain. I'm where I belong, at sea, on this ship." He gestured around us. "We all are, we." Hayes smiled again, but didn't answer. He turned back to the railing, and as I watched, his form seemed to blur at the edges, becoming indistinct against the night sky. Within moments he had faded entirely, leaving me alone on the deck with only the sound of dripping water where he had stood. I reached out, touching the wet spot with trembling fingers. The water was cold and salty, seawater. I returned to my cabin in a daze, convinced I'd experienced some sort of waking dream or hallucination. Perhaps the stress of retirement was affecting me more than I'd realized. Or maybe it was simply fatigue from the departure procedures and the emotional weight of my final voyage. Whatever the explanation, I decided not to mention the incident to anyone. The last thing I needed was for my crew to question my mental fitness during my final command. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen William Hayes on the deck. By morning I had almost succeeded. The next day passed without incident. We made good time, the weather remained favorable, and the crew went about their duties with practiced efficiency. I spent most of the day on the bridge, monitoring our progress and completing the necessary paperwork. If anyone noticed that I was more subdued than usual, they didn't comment on it. That night I delayed going to bed as long as possible, reviewing equipment reports and maintenance logs until my eyes burned with fatigue. When I finally retired to my cabin shortly after midnight, exhaustion overcame my anxiety, and I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. The dream began as many of my dreams do, on the deck of a ship, though not necessarily the Helene May. I was walking along the port side, inspecting something undefined but important. The sky above was storm dark, the sea beneath churning with white-capped waves. I wasn't afraid. Storms at sea were familiar territory after 4 decades of sailing. As I reached the stern, I became aware that I wasn't alone. A group of figures stood near the railing, huddled together as if in conversation. I approached them, recognizing their silhouettes against the darkening horizon. Hayes was there, still dripping wet, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Michael Rodriguez, a deckhand who'd been lost overboard during a storm 5 years earlier. and next to Rodriguez was Sarah Chen, our former communications officer who'd succumbed to an unexpected aneurysm midway through a Pacific crossing. They turned as I approached, their faces pale in the strange light of the dream. All three were soaking wet, seawater pooling at their feet. "Captain," they greeted me in unison, their voices overlapping in an unsettling harmony. "What are you doing here?" I asked, dream logic making the question seem perfectly reasonable despite the impossibility of their presence. "We never left," Sarah said, water trickling from the corner of her mouth as she spoke. "The sea keeps what belongs to it, and we belong to the Helene May," Rodriguez added, "just as you do." Hayes stepped forward, extending a dripping hand toward me. "Join us, Captain, your time is coming." "The sea is waiting," I backed away, a sense of dread building in my chest. "I'm not dead." "Not yet," Hayes agreed, his eyes reflecting something that wasn't in the sky above us. "But soon. This is your last voyage, after all." The dream shifted then, the deck beneath my feet tilting at an impossible angle. The three figures remained standing perfectly upright despite the ship's movement, their expressions unchanged as I slid toward the railing. I grabbed for a handhold, finding nothing but smooth, wet metal. The railing hit me at the waist, and I began to topple backward toward the churning sea below. Hayes, Rodriguez, and Chen watched impassively as I fell, their voices following me down. "The sea never forgets, Captain, and neither do we." I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. My quarters were dark except for the faint glow of the digital clock, 3:42 a.m. I sat up, running a shaking hand through my hair, trying to dispel the lingering images from the dream. My sheets were damp with sweat, and for one terrifying moment, I thought they might be wet with seawater instead. The ship's engines hummed steadily beneath me, a reassuring vibration that had lulled me to sleep countless nights over the years. I focused on that sensation, on the familiar motion of the vessel as it cut through the waves, just a dream. Nothing more than a dream brought on by yesterday's hallucination and the stress of my impending retirement. I rose, needing to move, to remind myself of the solid reality of the ship around me. I pulled on my clothes and stepped into the corridor, intending to go to the bridge for a status update. The passageway was empty, the lighting dimmed for night operations as usual. I had taken only a few steps when I noticed something odd, a trail of water droplets leading away from my door toward the stern of the ship. I followed the wet trail, my unease growing with each step. It led past the officers' quarters, past the crew mess, toward the engine room. I hesitated at the heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," then pushed it open and descended the metal stairs into the heart of the ship. The engine room was a cathedral of machinery, massive diesel engines driving the propeller shafts, auxiliary generators providing electrical power, pumps and valves and control panels monitoring every aspect of the vessel's operation. The space thrummed with energy, hot and loud compared to the relative quiet of the upper decks. The water trail continued across the metal floor, winding between equipment stations toward the main control panel. Chief Engineer Morales should have been on duty, but his station was empty. Instead, William Hayes sat in the engineer's chair, his hands moving over the controls with familiar expertise. He didn't look up as I approached, his attention focused on the gauges before him. "Pressure's running a bit high in the starboard cooling system," he said by way of greeting, as if we were in the middle of a normal conversation. "Might want to have Morales take a look at that." I stopped several feet away from him, unwilling to come closer. "You're not real," I said, echoing my words from the previous night. "This is some kind of hallucination." Hayes looked up then, his two bright eyes fixing on mine. "If that's what you need to believe, Captain," he gestured toward the engines. "But hallucination or not, that cooling system needs attention. The Helene May deserves better than to be neglected." "Where's Morales?" I demanded, looking around the engine room for my chief engineer. "Taking a break, I imagine." Hayes turned back to the controls. "Don't worry, I've got things under control down here. I always did, didn't I?" I backed away, unwilling to continue the conversation. This wasn't real, it couldn't be real. I turned and hurried back up the stairs, nearly colliding with Morales as he returned to his post. "Captain," he looked surprised to see me. "Everything all right?" I glanced back down the stairs. Hayes was gone, the engineer's chair empty once more. "Just checking on things," I managed to say. "Thought I heard something unusual in the engine noise." Morales frowned. "The engines are running smoothly, sir." "I was just in the head, but I've been monitoring all systems. No anomalies to report." "Good." I nodded, trying to appear normal despite my racing heart. "Carry on then." I retreated to the upper deck, needing fresh air and open space to clear my head. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. I gripped the railing, focusing on the solid feel of metal beneath my hands, the real sound of waves against the hull, the tangible presence of the ship around me. "Beautiful night, isn't it, Captain?" The voice came from beside me, and I turned to find Sarah Chen standing there, looking exactly as she had in life except for the water streaming from her hair and clothes. Unlike Hayes, she made no pretense of normalcy. Her skin was too pale, with a faintly bluish tinge, and when she smiled I could see that her teeth had the gray cast of a drowned corpse. "You're not here," I said firmly, closing my eyes. "When I open my eyes, you'll be gone." "Will I?" Her voice sounded closer. "Or will there be more of us? The sea is patient, Captain Thorne, but it always collects what belongs to it." I kept my eyes shut, counting slowly to 10, focusing on my breathing. When I reached 10, I opened my eyes. Chen was gone, but the deck where she had stood was wet with seawater. I returned to my cabin, locking the door behind me, though I knew it would make no difference. If these apparitions were real, and I still wasn't convinced they were anything but hallucinations, no lock would keep them out. If they were products of my mind, then the enemy was already inside with me. I didn't sleep for the remainder of the night. I sat at my desk, making notes in my personal log about engine performance and weather conditions, steadfastly ignoring the water that occasionally seeped under my door only to evaporate minutes later. By morning I was exhausted but determined to maintain my command presence. I showered, shaved, and dressed in my uniform, then made my way to the bridge for the morning briefing. First Officer Jenkins was already there, reviewing the night's logs. "Morning, Captain," he said, handing me a mug of coffee. "We've made excellent time overnight, weather's holding steady, and we're actually ahead of schedule." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "Any issues to report?" "None, sir. Smooth sailing." He hesitated, studying my face. "If you don't mind my saying so, you look tired. Everything all right?" "Fine," I said curtly. "Just didn't sleep well." "Still adjusting to being back at sea?" Jenkins nodded, though he looked skeptical. In 18 years together on the Helen May, he'd never known me to have trouble adjusting to life at sea. If anything, it was returning to land that usually disrupted my sleep patterns. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see Hayes or Chen or Rodriguez watching me from doorways or across rooms. But my ghostly visitors seemed to prefer the night hours, and I encountered nothing more unsettling than a few unexplained puddles of water that the crew attributed to minor leaks. That evening I joined the officers for dinner in the mess, something I rarely did. I told myself it was a gesture of camaraderie for my final voyage, but in truth, I dreaded being alone. The conversation was pleasant enough, talk of families waiting at home, plans for shore leave in Singapore, speculation about the shipping company's newest vessels. I contributed little, but my presence seemed to be enough to satisfy protocol. After dinner, I returned to the bridge for the evening check-in, then reluctantly made my way back to my cabin. I considered staying up all night, but I knew that sleep deprivation would only make matters worse. Whatever was happening, hallucination, haunting, or mental breakdown, I needed to be rested to deal with it. I lay down fully clothed, leaving the lights on, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The dream was different this time. I was in the cargo hold of the Helen May, surrounded by shipping containers stacked in neat rows. The space was dimly lit, shadows gathering in the corners and between the massive metal boxes. I was searching for something, moving between the containers with increasing urgency, though I couldn't have said what I was looking for. As I rounded a corner, I found them, not just Hayes, Rodriguez, and Chen, but others as well. Crew members who had died under my command over the decades. Thompson, who'd suffered a fatal heart attack on a voyage to Marseille. Patel, lost during a storm in the South China Sea. Yamamoto, who'd succumbed to pneumonia before we could reach port. A dozen faces, all watching me with those two bright eyes, all dripping with seawater that pooled around their feet. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my dream self showing more courage than I felt. "We want what's ours," Hayes said, stepping forward as their apparent spokesman. "The sea has claimed us, Captain. And now it's claiming the Helen May." "The ship isn't sinking," I protested. "She's sound." "She's dying," Chen corrected me. "Being decommissioned, scrapped. Once you deliver this cargo, they're sending her to the breakers in Bangladesh." "Didn't they tell you?" I stared at her, a cold certainty settling in my gut that she was telling the truth. The company had been vague about the Helen May's future after my retirement. "They're replacing her with newer vessels," I said weakly. "They're killing her," Rodriguez said, "and us with her. We belong to this ship, Captain. Our souls are bound to her. When she's torn apart, what happens to us?" I had no answer for that. The dream logic made a terrible kind of sense. These people had died aboard the Helen May, had been buried at sea from her decks, or had breathed their last in her cabins. If there were such things as ghosts, wouldn't they haunt the place of their death? "What do you expect me to do?" I asked. "I'm retiring. This is my last voyage." "Yes," Hayes agreed, smiling that terrible smile. "It is." The group began to move toward me, water sloshing around their feet as they advanced. I backed away, finding myself against a container with nowhere to go. Their cold, wet hands reached for me, and I could feel the chill of the grave in their touch. The sea keeps what belongs to it, they intoned together, their voices creating that same unsettling harmony I'd heard before. And we all belong to the sea. I woke gasping for breath, my clothes soaked through with sweat. I told myself just sweat. My cabin was dark, the lights I'd left on had been extinguished, and I wasn't alone. They stood around my bed, Hayes, Chen, Rodriguez, and all the others from my dream. In the darkness, their eyes gleamed with an inner light that cast faint blue shadows across their drowned features. Water dripped steadily from their clothes onto my floor, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe as they watched me with those terrible glowing eyes. Hayes leaned down, his face inches from mine, the smell of salt and rot washing over me. "The company lied to you, Captain," he whispered, his voice like the rush of water over stones. "They're not honoring your service. They're using you to deliver the Helene May to her death." "No," I managed to say, finding my voice at last. "You're not real, this isn't happening." "Check the orders," Chen said from the foot of my bed. "The real orders. Not the ones they showed you. In the company safe," Rodriguez added. "Behind the bridge, the code is 5 9 3 8 1. Hayes straightened up, his expression almost pitying. "You've been a good captain, Thorne. Respected the sea, honored the dead. Don't let them destroy the Helene May. Don't let them destroy us." They began to fade then, their forms becoming transparent, the glow of their eyes dimming until I was alone in the darkness once more. The only evidence of their visit was the pool of seawater on my cabin floor and the lingering smell of the ocean depths. I lay there for several minutes, my heart gradually slowing from its panicked race. Then I rose, changed into dry clothes, and made my way to the bridge. It was just after 2 a.m. and Third Officer Chen, no relation to our ghostly visitor, was on duty. "Captain," he looked surprised to see me. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," I said shortly. "I need to check something in the company safe. Continue your duties." "Aye, sir." The company safe was located in a small room adjacent to the bridge, used for storing sensitive documents and valuable items that might be carried as special cargo. As first officer, Jenkins knew the combination, as did I, but the code Rodriguez had given me was different from the one I'd been using. I hesitated, then entered 5 9 3 8 1 into the keypad. The safe clicked open. Inside, among the expected documents, was a sealed envelope marked "Captain's Eyes Only Post-Delivery Instructions." It was dated 3 months earlier and signed by the Fleet Operations Director. I opened it with trembling hands. The letter inside confirmed everything my ghostly visitors had told me. Upon delivery of our cargo to Singapore, the Helene May was to proceed to a ship-breaking yard in Chittagong, Bangladesh, where she would be dismantled for scrap. The company had already sold her, and the contract had been finalized months ago. I was to oversee her delivery to the breakers and then return home on a commercial flight, my retirement effective immediately thereafter. They had lied to me. After 18 years commanding this vessel, after a lifetime at sea, they hadn't even had the decency to tell me that my final voyage was also the Helene May's last journey. I returned to the bridge, the letter clutched in my hand. Third Officer Chen glanced at me but said nothing about my ashen face or the document I was crushing in my grip. "Adjust our course," I said abruptly. "New heading 175 degrees. Chen blinked in surprise. "Sir, that would take us south, away from our planned route." "I'm aware of that. Execute the order." "Aye, Captain," he hesitated. "Should I note the course change in the log?" I considered for a moment. "No, maintain radio silence as well. I'll explain everything to the crew in the morning." Chen looked troubled but nodded. "Course adjusted to 175 degrees, sir." "Good, I'll take the watch now. You're dismissed." Once alone on the bridge, I stared out at the dark ocean stretching before us. What was I doing? Altering course without explanation, planning to essentially steal a vessel worth millions. It was madness. I would lose my pension, possibly face criminal charges, and for what? Because some hallucinations, some manifestations of my guilty conscience over lives lost under my command, had told me the ship was being scrapped, but the letter was real. The company's betrayal was real. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that Hayes and the others were real too, in their own way. The sea never forgets, my father had said. Perhaps it doesn't let go either. I maintained our new heading through the night. When Jenkins arrived for the morning watch, I showed him the letter and explained my decision. To my surprise, he didn't object. "The Helene May deserves better than to be torn apart on some beach," he said quietly. "And so do you, Captain. What's the plan?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. "South," I said, "into the open Pacific, beyond shipping lanes. I need time to think." Jenkins nodded. "The crew will follow you, you know that," and they did. When I explained the situation at an all-hands meeting later that morning, there were no objections, no arguments. These men and women had served aboard the Helene May for years. Many of them had known Hayes, Chen, Rodriguez, and the others who now haunted our vessel. They understood what it meant to belong to a ship, to the sea. For 3 days we sailed south, deeper into the Pacific, away from the major shipping routes. The company tried to contact us, of course, but we maintained radio silence. They would have reported us missing by now, perhaps even dispatched vessels to search for us. But the ocean is vast, and a ship that doesn't want to be found can disappear surprisingly effectively. The apparitions continued to appear each night, but their manner had changed. They seemed less threatening, more watchful, as if waiting to see what I would decide. Hayes would stand silently on the bridge beside me during the night watches. Chen would appear in the communications room, her dripping form reflected in the dark screens of the radio equipment. Rodriguez walked the decks, leaving wet footprints that evaporated in the morning sun. The living crew began to report sightings as well, glimpses of figures that shouldn't be there, puddles of seawater in impossible locations, the sound of phantom footsteps in empty corridors. No one seemed particularly frightened. Like me, they had accepted the presence of our ghostly passengers as just another aspect of life at sea. On the fourth night, I stood alone on the bridge, the Helene May cutting through calm waters under a star-filled sky. We were low on fuel, our supplies dwindling. Soon, we would have to make a decision, return to civilization and face the consequences of our actions, or continue into the emptiness of the Pacific until we could go no further. Hayes materialized beside me, his form more solid than I had ever seen it. The other spirits gathered behind him, Chen, Rodriguez, Thompson, Patel, Yamamoto, and all the rest. Their eyes glowed softly in the darkness, but there was no malice in their expressions now, only expectation. "You know what needs to be done, Captain," Hayes said softly. "The sea keeps what belongs to it." I did know. Perhaps I had known from the moment I'd read that letter, from the first time Hayes had appeared to me on the deck. The Helene May belonged to the sea, not to the breakers in Bangladesh, and in some way so did I. "The crew," I said, my voice rough, "they have families, lives ashore. There's a lifeboat," Chen reminded me, "provisions, emergency beacons, they would be found within days." "And you want me to stay?" I said. It wasn't a question. Hayes nodded. "This is your ship, Captain, your last voyage, see it through to the end." The next morning I gathered the crew and explained my plan. There were objections this time, arguments, even tears, but in the end they understood. Jenkins would take command of the lifeboat, leading the crew to safety with a story of mechanical failure and an abandoned ship. They would face questions, investigations, but eventually they would return to their lives. I would remain aboard the Helene May for her final journey. We spent the day preparing the lifeboat, loading it with supplies, and checking the emergency equipment. I wrote a final log entry explaining my decision, absolving the crew of any responsibility. As the sun began to set, we gathered on the deck for farewells. "It's not too late to change your mind, Captain," Jenkins said, his voice thick with emotion. "Come with us." I shook my head. "My place is here." "It always has been," I clasped his shoulder. "You're a fine officer, Jenkins. You'll make a good captain someday." The rest of the goodbyes were equally difficult. These people had been my family for years, and I was sending them away while choosing to remain with the dead. But as the lifeboat pulled away from the Helene May, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I returned to the bridge and set a new course, due south, into the deepest part of the Pacific. Then I disabled the tracking systems and emergency beacons. The Helene May would disappear from the world's records, becoming another mystery of the sea. Hayes stood beside me as I worked, his presence comforting rather than frightening now. "You're doing the right thing," he said, "for the ship, for us, for yourself." I know, and I did know. After 43 years at sea, after a lifetime of service to vessels that carried me across the world's oceans, this was the only fitting end. Not a retirement party with cheap champagne, not a gold watch and a condo in Florida, but this, a final voyage into the heart of the element that had defined my existence. The others joined us on the bridge as night fell, all the souls who had given their lives to the Helene May over the years. They no longer dripped with seawater, no longer carried the pallor of death. They looked as they had in life, whole and vibrant, going about their duties as if we were simply on another routine crossing. "How long?" I asked Hayes as the stars emerged above us. He smiled, a real smile this time, warm and human. "Until the fuel runs out, a week, maybe 2, then we'll drift for a while. Eventually a storm will come." I nodded, accepting the inevitability of it. And then we'll join the others." He gestured toward the dark waters surrounding us. "The sea keeps what belongs to it, Captain. We'll be together, part of the Helene May forever." I looked out at the endless ocean, at the path of moonlight stretching toward the horizon. My father had been right all those years ago. The sea never forgets. It keeps its own record of every ship, every sailor, every promise. And now it would keep me as well. I am Captain Malcolm Thorne, and this is my final voyage. The Helen May sails south, carrying her ghostly crew and her living captain toward whatever waits beneath the waves. I am not afraid. After a lifetime at sea, I'm simply going home. The ocean stretches before us, dark and eternal. We sail on.